Morning, Ashok Das sir.
Good morning. Okay.
Basu, can you hear?
Well, is someone going to introduce me? Jaydeep?
Basu, start.
I'm having a problem playing clips, the video clips which we had looked forward to playing. Let's see, we'll keep on trying. Okay, so a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Good morning from here, and it is good evening for Professor Ashcroft over there. And we are very, very grateful that, we arranged for this quite historic occasion, because we believe, and we have reason to believe, that Professor Ashcroft is here on a virtual platform for the first time. So it has been, a wonderful journey getting connected with him, persuading him to talk to us, and, convincing him that we will all be able to overcome the hurdles of, virtual communication. So here it is. We are here to listen to one of the most brilliant, one of the sharpest, one of the most powerful theorists in the world today, the great Professor Bill Ashcroft. So this program is being jointly hosted by the English department of two colleges from the eastern region of India. We have New Alipur College, Kolkata. We have Karim City College, Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. And together, we are proud, we are honored, we are grateful, all of you here who have joined in to tune in. Brilliant lecture on post-colonialism today. So we welcome all of you. We welcome especially Professor Ashcroft. We welcome Professor Jaydeep, who is also a host for this session and who will also be conversing with Professor Ashcroft today to bring more elements of post-colonial theory to our notice. So without further delay, I would request the head of department, Karim City College, Department of English, Dr. S.M. Yahya Ibrahim, to kindly offer the welcome address for today's session. Professor Ibrahim. So you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
You are, yes.
Thank you so much. Welcome all, the dignitaries today, the scholars today, the teachers and the students who are joining us today. Welcome you all. Give us your blessings and join with us to welcome our distinguished guest today. We are in fact joining together, all the hosts, all the participants for today. Let us join hands to welcome the strongest voice of post-colonialism and the literary world today. The departments of English, New Alipur College, and the Department of English, Karim City College, solicit your togetherness to accord a heartfelt welcome to the stalwart of contemporary literary studies. Welcome, Bill Ashcroft, sir. When we think of post-coloniality, we also think of the colonial days. What imperialism was to colonialism is globalization or corporatism. The same for post-colonialism. When Fanon's wretched of the world feels miserable, and when the subaltern cannot speak, Ashcroft, sir, writes back for the post-colonial voices. When we think of post-coloniality in literature, we talk about our diasporic writers too, I often wonder that why the American literature by and large is not bracketed under the post-colonial. I am also surprised to see not one, but many Englishes around us. And I'm also surprised to see not one, but multiple voices within these many Englishes in the post-colonial world. In such inquisitiveness, we look towards the very loved and admired Mr. Bill Ashcroft, and his writings are our A to Z on post-colonialism. So in this world, when everything is post, so it is post-truth, post-humanism, and post-nation, post-colonialism is still a huge voice. And the grandest thing, the greatest thing that is happening to post-colonialism today is certainly Mr. Bill Ashcroft. So with such inquisitiveness, awe, and admiration, we all welcome him together in this session today. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I present my agenda. And
Thank you, yes, sir. And we are indeed very grateful to have Professor Ashcroft with us today. The entire program of today is going to be structured in 3 parts. So after we are over with the formalities of introduction, we will be handing over the mic to Professor Ashcroft for a presentation on post-colonialism today. This will be followed by a conversation between Professor Ashcroft and Professor Sarangi. And the third part to this program will be a question-answer session with the audience. Members of the audience are requested to keep on posting their questions in the chat box as and when it occurs to them. And there will be people who will be selecting questions from there and putting them to Professor Ashcroft at the end of the session. So when you are putting your question, you kindly need to mention your name and your affiliation details so that these can be posed along with the question. We move over to an understanding of the theme of this entire program, and I would request Professor Neela Sarkar from the Department of English, New Alipur College, to kindly introduce the theme of today's conversation to our esteemed audience. Professor Neela Sarkar. Neela ma'am, you have to unmute yourself, Neela ma'am. You are muted. You have to unmute your microphone to be audible to us. Yes, thank you so much.
Am I audible now? Okay.
Yes, ma'am, perfectly.
Okay.
Perfectly.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. And a very good morning to Professor Ashcroft. And introducing the theme where Professor Ashcroft is the speaker is, well, really a very daunting task. And since most of the listeners here are the faculty and my esteemed colleagues from all parts of the country, I am not going to even attempt to speak on post-colonialism, but as such, but this is just very briefly for the students who may have logged in and for whom it may be something new. Okay, so post-colonialism appeared in the context of the aftermath of Western colonialism that marked the second half of the 20th century. As a field of academic study, it has been taken up by at least half a dozen disciplines, literary and culture studies being one of the disciplines where post-colonial discourse has a major impact and a strong base. The field of post-colonial studies has been growing in importance since mid-20th century. However, there remains considerable debate over the scope and definition of the term itself. In a very general sense, it is the study of the interactions between European nations and the countries they had colonized. Europe is considered to have established her colonies over more than 85% of the rest of the world by the end of World War I. The list of former European colonies is a long one. They may be divided into, well, settler colonies like Canada and Australia, and non-settler colonies like India, Jamaica, Nigeria, etc. But countries like South Africa and Zimbabwe, however, blurred this distinction because they were only partially settled. Naturally, the experiences of these countries were bound to be widely divergent under colonialism and later decolonization. Scholars like Frans Fanon, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Helen Tiffin, Bill Ashcroft, Bell Hooks, and Henry Louis Gates are but some of the scholars who have done extensive research to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. The principal of Karimchand College had said why America is not included. Well, Bell Hooks and Henry Louis Gates are from America who have theorized on postcolonialism. Indeed, a post-structuralist in this post-structuralist environment and drawing on its methodology, post-colonial critics analyze the repercussions of European cultural hegemony and territorial expansion from the beginning to the present day. Thus, it concerns itself with the study of colonization, the decolonization, which involves winning back and reconstituting the native cultures, and the new colonizing process, that is the aftermath of capitalism and globalization. Postcolonialism examines the ubiquitous power struggles between cultures and the intersections of these cultures. It analyzes the metaphysical, ethical, political issues regarding identity, gender, ethnicity, nationality, race, language, and power, among a host of other things. At the moment, there are some critics who are now saying that post-colonialism is now a thing of the past. And now it is on post is now post. So today, we eagerly look forward to Professor Ashcroft's deliberations on this very complicated issue of what constitutes and what still is post-colonialism. And who better than Professor Ashcroft, the leading exponent in the area of post-colonial studies, his, to shed light on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will start now.
I will introduce you, Professor Ashcroft. We need to introduce you, though you need no introduction, you need no introduction to the world of academia. We have to formally introduce you because we have the privilege of welcoming you today. So I would now call upon Professor Upadhyay, the head of Department English, New Alipur College, to present a brief introduction. For any introduction to you, can only be brief. There is so much to be said about you. Request Bolu ma'am to kindly introduce Professor Ashcroft to the audience.
Thank you. Very good morning to all present here. I thank the principal of Karim City College and our principal, and I welcome Professor Bill Ashcroft. I have the honor to speak on his bio note, to introduce him today, but he doesn't need any introduction as such. Professor Bill Ashcroft is a renowned critic and theorist, founding exponent of post-colonial theory, co-author of The Empire Strikes Back, the first text to offer a systematic examination of the field of post-colonial studies. He is author and co-author of 21 books and over 200 articles and chapters, various translated into 6 languages, and he is on the editorial boards of 10 international journals. His latest work is Utopianism in Postcolonial Literatures. He is editor Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales and is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Thank you, Professor Bill Ashcroft, for we are honored.
Well, thank you very much. Now, let me share my...
Yes, now we go over to the much awaited part and the core part of our program. And I hand over the platform to you, Professor Ashcroft, for your talk on postcolonialism today.
Thank you.
You want to present?
I'm trying to share my screen. Let me see how it goes.
Yes, please. Please do. Present now.
Yeah. It said something is preventing me from sharing.
Nobody else has shared their screen.
Yeah.
You can click on present now.
Present now.
And window. Choose the window option.
Yeah, it won't. No, it won't come up. Sorry, it doesn't seem to be. Oh, hang on. Working.
Just try once again.
All right. Let me stop sharing and then present now. Present a window.
Yes.
This window and share. Okay, and then.
Yes, you're doing it.
I'm presenting my screen.
Yes.
Sorry about this. Won't come up.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Can't see the full screen though, can we? Try that. Oh, okay. Can you see that?
Yes,
we can,
yes,
we can see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your kind introduction. It's very exciting to be here, to talking to people from across the world. And I want to talk about postcolonialism today. But to start off, I want to say that over 30 years ago, The Empire Writes Back was published to join together the textual attentiveness of Commonwealth literatures with sophisticated contemporary theoretical models. But ever since that book was published, the postcolonial studies, the people who study postcolonial issues, have been produced one of the most febrile and argumentative disciplines that we can imagine. So let me, before I talk about what is postcolonialism today, let me say, well, what is postcolonial theory? Well, the formal definition is that branch of contemporary theory that investigates and develops propositions about the cultural and political impact of European conquest upon colonized societies and the nature of those societies' responses. So there's two aspects. It's an analysis of the impact of empire upon the world, upon colonized societies, but more interestingly, it's about those societies' responses. Now, what about the post? Well, the term refers, if anything, to post-invasion and not post-independence. It identifies neither a chronology nor a specific ontology. There's no specific way of being post-colonial. It's not after colonialism, nor is it a way of being. Post-colonial is a way of reading. Now, when we originally used the term post-colonial, we hyphenated it to show that it wasn't a grand theory like postmodernism, but it was after the invasion of the colonizers. But unfortunately, that backfired, and people immediately thought that it was a chronological term. Well, it's not chronological. Postcolonial is a way of reading. It's a reading practice that draws attention to the profound and continuing effects of colonisation upon literary production. Anthropological accounts, historical records, and scientific and administrative writing. Now, above all, it's a reading of postcolonial literatures. And let's think about postcolonial futures. Around the turn of the century, there was a wild plethora of books imagining what the future of postcolonialism would be. You know, the future of postcolonial studies, the postcolonial futures, where will postcolonialism go? My own book, Postcolonial Futures, and a final chapter of The Empire Writes Back, the third edition. We were talking about postcolonial futures at that time, but it's interesting to look back in the 90s. The language of postcolonialism drove the cultural turn in globalization in the 1990s. And ever since that time, cultural globalization and postcolonial studies have had an interesting and sometimes argumentative relationship. But it transpires that postcolonial theory offers strategies that are useful for examining the power structures of the globalized world today. Now, in terms of the futures, there was a plethora of books about this at the turn of the century. The turn of the century seemed to offer itself as a prime time to think about the future. But growing themes, and I'll just talk briefly about these, transnational literatures. Of course, one of the things that postcolonial studies has expanded into is the issue of transnationalism and diaspora. There's also transculturalism. Mary Louise Pratt brought this term from its South American progenitors into postcolonial studies. The transcultural talks about meeting in a contact zone where both parties have changed. And I want to suggest that in a very real sense, postcolonial literatures are transcultural. And also multiple modernities. Now, there used to be an assumption that modernity was European and that it was inherited by the non-European world. But in fact, one of the aspects of postcolonial studies is to show that modernities have been developing in countries around the world quite apart from an inheritance an inheritance of European modernity. Notwithstanding, some of those aspects of modernity have been adopted, adapted, and transformed. There's also the issue of world literature, which has an interesting relationship with postcolonial studies. Postcolonial literatures are, in their own sense, a world literature. Cosmopolitanism, which has got a very tense relationship with postcolonial studies, and I may talk about that later in question time. But also the postcolonial sacred, postcolonial eco-criticism. And I could go on and talk about these things at length, but I don't. That'd be a bit boring, because what I want to talk about is something dear to my heart. I want to talk about how am I developing postcolonial studies. And there are three things I want to talk about today. I want to talk about postcolonial utopianism, borders and bordering, and what I call the transnation. Now, all of these are of interest, and I'm particularly interested in postcolonial utopianism, which always raises a lot of questions in people's minds. The Utopian Studies Society was formed in 1988 and the Empire Writes Back written in 1989. But there's been virtually no interaction between the two until I wrote Utopianism and Postcolonial Literatures. There was only one other book that even thought about the utopian in the postcolonial sense. And so it's been very close to my heart to draw these two things together. And of course, that's produces problems of various kinds. But I'd say the whole discourse of utopianism is driven by Ernst Bloch's magisterial The Principle of Hope, produced in English in 1986, but originally Das Prinzip Hoffnung, he wrote from 1938 to 1947. And there's been many other proponents of utopianism, such as Paul Ricoeur, Karl Mannheim, and most recently, of course, Frederick Jameson, whose Archaeologies of the Future was the latest of his attempts to combine the Marxist views of utopianism with science fiction. He made it and continues to make groundbreaking efforts into the analysis of science fiction. But there's a difference between utopia and utopianism. Now, a lot of people, when you say utopia, they think, oh, this is a vain wish fulfillment, pie in the sky kind of thing. And there is definitely a difference between the placeless place of Thomas More's Utopia and the spirit of hope. There's a difference between the representation of utopia and the anticipatory function of utopianism. Now, utopias are fictional, imaginary, but they're there to demonstrate possibility. And all utopias are a critique of the present. But utopianism is fundamental to postcolonial studies, particularly postcolonial creative production. Because, as Ernst Bloch says, utopias may be fantasies, but without hope, we cannot live. Lyman Tower Sargent calls utopianism social dreaming, very different from the placeless place of the utopian. Bruce Levitas says it's the desire for a better way of living expressed in the description of a different kind of society that makes possible that alternative way of life. Now, that's a comprehensive view of utopia and utopianism. Utopianism to the postcolonial is about a different kind of future. It's about hope and it's about transformation. Now, it's very ironic, the postcolonial utopia, because when we go back to Thomas More's Utopia, we see that King Utopus invades the land of the Abraxa. He changes its name, he civilizes the indigenous inhabitants and cultivates the natural wasteland. And this is almost a compendium of the colonial process. Invasion, name change, civilization, cultivation. The idea that development and improvement is what colonialism is about. But of course, what we found out by experience is that colonialism is about identifying and exploiting resources. So the interesting thing about Utopia is that it has a kind of quite conflicting relationship with the nation state. Now, it's been said that imperialism has developed identity. And whether that's true or not, it's certain that identity was forged in the heat of resistance. So in other words, what it's saying is that imperialism, in a sense, created national identity as a way of resisting the invading power. But J.A. Hobson, in his very influential Imperialism study, says that colonialism, in its best sense, and by that he meant the settler colonies, is a natural overflow of nationality. And when a state advances beyond the limits of nationality, its power becomes precarious and artificial. And what he's saying there is that when an imperial state advances beyond the limits of its own nationality, when it tries to take over other peoples, other countries, other societies, other cultures, then it becomes precarious and artificial. And history has borne that out. History has shown that the dominance of empire has been very precarious. The Second World War saw the end of the British Empire. Pretty much by the 1960s, there were no colonies left. So Hobson thought that an empire-bred nationalism undermined the chance of a true internationalism, because nationalism creates borders. Nationalism creates an enclosure, and it prevents true internationalism. Now, Partha Chatterjee, on the other hand, says that nationalism is a blow against true decolonization. The national form, he says, is hostile to the cultures of colonized societies. And that's an interesting point to make, because we realize that the idea of the nation, even in Europe, is fairly recent. It stems from the Treaty of Westphalia, and the idea of nation is not necessarily something that enhances the future of colonized cultures. So, in other words, what you have is postcolonial utopianism develops a critique of the nation state. Some interesting things happened in postcolonial relationship with its colonizers. Nationalism was an important strategy, an important motivation for resistance and breaking away from the imperial rule. But as Tagore and Gandhi realized, the nationalism is an enclosing and restricting thing. And in post-colonial societies, what happened was that after independence, the independent governments simply took on the structure, the architecture of the colonial state, and continued its dominating impact. So now, when we think about utopianism, it's important to go back to Ernst Bloch. And the concept of Heimat is an interesting one. But for Ernst Bloch, the importance of art and literature in imaging a different world was absolutely crucial. And this is why I want to say that art and literature have been crucial in the post-colonial transformation of dominant imperial discourses. And they are important because they develop a Vorschein, a foreseeing or anticipatory illumination, the revelation of the possibilities for rearranging social and political relations to produce Heimat. Now, what was Heimat? Well, Heimat's a German word for home, but Ernst Bloch used Heimat in a particular way. He said, Heimat is the home we have all sensed but never experienced or known. It is Heimat as utopia that determines the truth content of a work of art. Now, we could go into a long discussion about that. The important thing about this is that for Bloch, art and literature are absolutely crucial because they are the ones that can conceive and reveal the possibilities for rearranging social and cultural relations. And so for Bloch, Heimat always lies beyond the border of the nation and beyond the border of self-interest and of culture. And so that leads to the next theme I want to talk about, and that is borders and bordering. And that word bordering is an interesting one because it is it reshapes the way in which we understand borders. But I want you to think what the world would look like without borders. Would it be possible? What would happen? The more we think about it, the more we realize that borders are necessary because borders organize the world into us and them, into powerful and powerless, and the borders could only be dissolved if the distinction that holds them in place between rich and poor nations, democratic and undemocratic, colonized and colonizing, the nation and its others, us and them, was itself dissolved. Now, borders exist basically because of fear. And it's interesting to see what has happened with borders. At the end of World War II, there were 7 border wars. When the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls. Today, there are 77 border walls or fences. And of course, we know of a few of the most toxic of those. The one trying to be built between the United States and Mexico, another one to encircle the Palestinian people in Israel. But what is a border? Now, we think of borders, when we think of borders, we think of those border walls, fences, physical structures, geographical lines on a map. But what is a border actually? Well, I want to suggest that a border is not a thing, but a practice. It's a practice that separates, and both a consequence and a production of power relationships. And so the idea of border as a practice introduces the concept of bordering. Now, in the poet Cavafy, in his poem Waiting for the Barbarians, as you know, is a poem that inspired Jan Katz's Waiting for the Barbarians. But the poem goes like this: why this sudden restlessness and confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home so lost in thought. Because might has fallen, and the barbarians have not come. And some who have just returned from the water say, there are no barbarians any longer. Now what will become of us without barbarians? They were, those people, kind of solution. Now, it's a very, very deep and philosophical poem, because what it's saying is that we need barbarians, we need the others, we need the outsiders, we need those who live beyond our borders, because they confirm who we are. Without the barbarians, what are we going to do? How are we going to understand who we are? And so this is the way in which borders work. The borders, because the borders are a practice, a bordering practice, they operate within as well as around a nation state. The boundary of the state never marks a real exterior. It's a line drawn internally within the network of institutional mechanisms through which a certain social and political order is maintained. So borders don't all simply operate around the edge of the nation. Borders operate within the nation to organise power, to organise people. And if we look at K.R. Simonson, he identified 8 borders or boundary markers as criteria for national membership. National ancestry, being of the national religion, birth on the country's soil, having lived in the country for most of one's life, language skills, respect for the country's laws and institutions, having host national citizenship and feeling as part of the nation. Now, all of us can identify these things in a particular way in which they operate in our nation. And these are borders, boundary markers, borders that determine whether you are in or out. And these borders are often used very relentlessly and ruthlessly by people within the nation to determine who are outsiders. And it doesn't matter what kind of nation it is, but this is the way in which borders work. In a sense, borders compel us to create outsiders, to create those who don't belong. Now that term belonging is an interesting one, because while we may think of our belonging to a nation, literature, creative work in general, is about unbelonging. This is why it's so powerful. And in Step Across This Line, Salman Rushdie says, good writing assumes a frontierless nation. Writers who serve frontiers have become border guards. In our deepest natures, we are frontier-crossing beings. We know this by the stories we tell ourselves, for we are storytelling animals too. So that the stories we tell, literature, the art of literatures, these are frontier crossing. And this is what literature is all about. It's not about simply recording what is, but it's about recording what is possible. And so Jan Coetzee says, humans were the only creatures with a part of their existence in the unknown, in the future, like a shadow cast before them, trying continually to catch up with that moving shadow, to inhabit the image of their hope. It's, that ties in, that dovetails beautifully with Ernst Bloch's notion of Heimat and hope, that we're continually projected into the future, trying to catch up with the moving shadow, the image of our hope. And this is why literature is so important in this, because it is in literature that that image is realized. That image is not just a vision of the future, but a critique of the present. Now, the thing about borders and internal borders raises a very interesting issue, and that of what I call the trans nation. Now, okay, so the nation is something which has its geographical borders, its cultural, and its social borders. So how does the trans nation fit in with the idea of borders? The trans nation is the fluid migrating outside of the state that begins within the nation. It's a way of talking about subjects who circulate around the bordering practices of the state. Now, these subjects may at certain times cohere and confirm and obey the bordering practices of the state. But subjects are, by their nature, a threat to the state because they have this constant potential of circulating around the bordering practices, the what you might call the carceral practices, the imprisoning practices of the state. Now, there's a number of theoretical antecedents to this, but just one of the most important, of course, Deleuze and Guattari, smooth and striated space. Smooth space is something like felt, it has no structure. Striated space is the sort of structures, the striations that represent the state, for instance, the organisation of the nation, the organisation of the national future. The smooth space is that space that's occupied by those subjects that I've talked about, subjects who circulate around the bordering practices of the state. The bordering, striated practices of the state are always circulated around and evaded. Now, you see, this is Scott talks about something called infrapolitics, which is the undramatic, everyday and mundane acts of quiet evasion, slowdowns, false compliance, feigned ignorance and sabotage carried out by factory workers that, when performed by many, change or alter a landscape of power. Now, the thing that's important to realise is that the transnation, the subjects of the transnation, are not necessarily insurgent. They're not necessarily rebellious, but they're always offer the potential of circulating around the structures by which the state organises people. In other words, what postcolonial theory suggests is that the idea of transformation and resistance that operates within the relationship, within the colonial relationship, can be used to understand the continuing relations of power within the state, within the world, and around the operation of cultural reality. Now, let's see. The creative spirit is the ultimate border crosser. This is what I want to suggest, that the creative spirit, a creative spirit that generated the hope for the future of the post-colonial subjects, is one that continues to cross borders, crosses borders of all kinds, discursive, philosophical, imaginative, political. It crosses borders without moving necessarily, and that is the source of the power of the creative spirit. So the horizontality of literature is particularly suited to the smooth space of the transnation. Its utopian potentiality is towards a future without borders and without dimensions. There is a conjunction between the concepts of transnation and the utopian transformation of borders that exceeds the term diasporic literatures or even the term cosmopolitanism. This is a conjunction of dissolving borders, both of space and time. Just as the transnation can no longer be conceived as lying beyond the borders of the nation, but also extending within, so post-colonial reading shows us that the utopian dimension of literature is located in its capacity to cross borders, to imagine a borderless future, and ultimately in its capacity to dissolve the boundary between past and future through acts of memory that paradoxically imagine a different world. Thank you very much. And this.
Thank you, Professor Ashcroft, and that was a brilliant presentation. You can just gauge the way it has captured the attention of the audience by the large number of questions that have already come into our chat boxes. We move on to the next section, to the next part of the program. And I would like to invite Professor Jaydeep Sarangi to join in a conversation with Professor Bill Ashcroft. We hoped that Professor Sarangi would be able to do justice to this, both as a host and also having been a former interviewer of Professor Ashcroft. I remember reading his interview in a polished journal with Professor Austin, and I hope and we are looking forward to two theorists and two critics trying to clear the wilderness and I talk about wilderness in Showalter's terms as wilderness being fertile. So as Showalter says, our theory is in wilderness. And we look forward to these two brilliant conversationalists illuminating further aspects, the finer, subtler aspects of post-colonial theory for us. So over to you, Professor Sarangi and Professor Ashcroft.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bashudhara. Thank you, Bill, for wonderful presentation in the morning. And you ushered many doors you knocked so that new scholars, new areas of looking into post-colonial theories. I think many scholars will take up projects and many professors, it will benefit certainly. Bill, I remember myself and Patrice Justin, we interviewed you almost 10 years back for a Polish journal, and where we started discussing about how do you view Empire Writes Back, a radical critique of Eurocentric notions of language and literature after a couple of decades of its publication. How do you view it?
Yeah, the Empire Writes Back was the right book for its time. There was a moment. You remember in '89, the Ballet Wall came down. The end of the USSR. It was a time of great change, great ferment, and it's interesting that the Empire Writes Back came at that point. It was, as I said before, the Utopian Studies Society was formed, and I think that it has had three reprints, three different editions, but we have, decided that it was something for its time that offered strategies that I think are still appropriate today, particularly the idea of language transformation, the idea of transformation as a form of resistance. So these things have been developed in books that we've written since then. So actually, I'd say that it has weathered quite well, because what the book is about strategies that can contest power, contest imperial power, and that imperial power continues into the world today in the form of neoliberalism and globalization. But I think that it's also important to realize that postcolonial studies, postcolonial theory is not a grand theory of everything. It can't, and I might sort of elaborate on that later. But the principles of language transformation, the principles of self-determination, of taking responsibility for your own self-representation, that remains an important feature of the strategies of postcolonial theory.
Yeah, thank you. And there is a chapter, Replacing Language. I think this chapter I read for more than 10 times, and it gave me an insight into look at new Englishes. So we are seeing a growing discipline of world Englishes, and which finds itself in dialogue with postcolonial studies. Is there a scope of text-based transformation of so-called standard academic English, do you think?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think, the English was transformed by postcolonial writers, And as a matter of fact, I would say that postcolonialism started with Macaulay's Minute, where he said, you should teach English. Well, what they didn't realise is that those people who are going to be taught English are going to take it and use it as a mode of self-representation. They're going to change the language and change English literature itself, which is a phenomenal thing. And so that was a specific way in which the transformation of language was used. But world Englishes operate in a very similar way. You know, world Englishes are about adapting a global language to your own local cultural identity. Now, the interesting thing about this is that world Englishes are still English, and English speakers can understand them. But like as the English that was used by postcolonial writers, it demonstrates that yes, I use your language, but in using it, I want to show you that I am different. I have a different culture. I have a different life, and I want you to understand it by understanding my English. So the same principles still apply, I think, in world Englishes. There are reasons for the adaptation and transformation of English.
So do you think that Indian writing in English, it will be branded as Indian writing in English even after 50 years, or will it be English writings?
That's an interesting because the famous Indian writers like Salman Rushdie, right from England and America, and so many of the postcolonial writers write from the imperial centre. But nevertheless, the question is, what are the issues that this writer is highlighting? What is he or she talking about? And what kinds of cultural tensions, what kind of cultural transformations are being addressed? And so very often, I think we can say that we can still call Rushdie an Indian writer, if you like, because of the issues that he talks about. But it's an interesting point. You know, we talk about Australian English writers. You know, Peter Carey lives in New York. So, but I think this is a sign of the way the world is going. You know, that there is a huge amount of mobility, and that people are crossing borders all the time, and they're writing things that are both cosmopolitan, if you like, and say modern, but also with a link to a cultural past. Now, one of the things I think is important about the future, about utopianism, is that postcolonial utopianism is rooted in memory, and memory not as nostalgia, but memory as a strategy for change. And I think that's true, you know, of postcolonial writers throughout the world.
Wonderful. As you mentioned, cosmopolitanism, the idea of citizens of the world is a compelling one, but how exactly is cosmopolitan, and who exactly is cosmopolitan?
Yes, I have a lot of problems with the term cosmopolitanism because it seems to be limited to those expatriates who can travel the world, you know, and it seems to be a very white term and a very classist term. I think we like to, you know, Homi Bhabha brings up terms like vernacular cosmopolitanism, but to me, cosmopolitanism is about people who are free to move, and that is not a great proportion of the world's population. So I'm in two minds about cosmopolitanism, because I think the idea of being at home in the world is a good one. It's a great utopian idea. But in reality, it doesn't apply to most of the world's population. I think this needs to be taken into account. So the argument over cosmopolitanism will go on, I suppose. Nevertheless, I have read books. I recently read a book in the light of what we know by Sia Ramananda, a Bangladeshi writer, which I think is amazing book and truly cosmopolitan, if you like. But not everybody has access to being a citizen of the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. And you talk about the strategies of postcolonialism. Do you subscribe to the view that literary works have the power to produce empathy in the reader by showing rather than telling?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I do. In fact, I've written a number of things about knowing beyond meaning. And I developed this from a book by Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht called The Production of Presence. Now, creative works can offer a presence that is beyond hermeneutics. So, yeah, things, I mean, as Eliot said, and harm should not mean but be. But I think in terms of works of art, there's something very, very deep and powerful about the presence of the work. The presence even of a work that is just beyond your understanding, say an artwork. And so I'm very committed to the idea of presence as a form of aesthetic engagement with them. Yeah. So whether it's literature or art, that idea of presence is very powerful.
Wonderful. And that's really true. And how do you see the cultural production and the power of new political rhetoric in the global policies and cultural determinants?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. I think that there's a number of ways of coming at this. And as I said, that the dominant toxic issues today are nationalism, populism, borders, the creation of outsiders. Now, all these can be addressed by postcolonial theory, postcolonial strategies. The ideas of the idea of a sharing, of being open to the stranger, which is one of the basic originary principles of cosmopolitanism, just doesn't seem to apply. So, yeah, I think that the new cultural political formations are still amenable to analysis by postcolonial theory. And that's what I think we should realise, that the strategies that have been developed are adaptable to the 21st century.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was so enlightening. And now, reading into new texts these days, I have a problem that only you can throw light on this. Do you accept the fact that new writers from different cultures are negotiating with their style of writing, keeping in mind the global audience?
Yeah. Yes, well, I think there's a principle that I've always held, that choosing a language is to choose an audience. Choosing a style is also to choose an audience.
Yeah.
And if the writer wants to choose that audience, then that's the audience that the writer wants to speak to. So I think, what you're primarily suggesting is there's a lack of authenticity in some of these writers. In fact, I think that there's no such thing as an authentic language. You know, there's the old saying that a language is a dialect with an army and navy. You know, so we all speak dialects, but the thing about writing, the thing about using language, is who do you want to hear this?
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
One last question before we go to so many big questions in the chat box, because I think they are asking questions. What advice would you give to a critique of post-colonial literature in the third decade of the 21st century? What will be your guidelines?
Okay. Keep yourself alert to all the different avenues for post-colonial theory, because there are so many, and I've mentioned a few at the beginning. These not normally regarded as post-colonial, but in fact post-colonial theory offers strategies to address them all. So I'd say to anyone entering into post-colonial studies, be alert to the very many different ways in which post-colonial theory can be operated, can be used today. Because this is the amazing thing. I said it's not a grand theory of everything, but it has strategies that can be adapted to look at global issues today. You know? And some of those most important issues are issues of nationalism and populism, the idea of borders, the idea of refugees and migration, of mobility. All these things are aspects of the present world that are observable by post-colonial theory.
Thank you, Bill. It was really enlightening. Thank you so much. Over to Vasudhara.
Thank you, Jaydeep.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to the third and the very riveting part of the session, because we have a wonderful audience with us today, very, very perceptive, very, very, aware, and a very, very interested audience who has put forward a host of questions here. And we are all, somehow I think every member of the audience can relate to the questions that appear in the chat box. And to take up these questions for the question answer session, I would like to invite Dr. Dhrubajyoti Banerjee of the Department of Ballet College, Kolkata, to kindly conduct the question answer session. Over to you, Dhruba.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. It was a very illuminating and a wonderful session that we all enjoyed. And the chat box is just flooded with questions. And I was just trying to make certain trends, if at all. And there is this one particular trend that I saw, which a couple of our co-participants have asked. And that is about the post-colonial feminism. There are actually two questions, one put forward by Gunjan Chaturvedi, and she talks about what are the main approaches to post-colonial feminism. And there is another colleague of ours, Shutapa Biswas. She says, we are said to be living in the period of post-feminism. How would you relate post-colonial notions of post-feminism with it? Over to you, sir.
Okay. I'm not sure that we're in the time of post-feminism. I think we're in the time of feminism getting stronger and stronger. Post-colonial feminism has been going very strongly since 1988, or earlier, with the book Double Colonization. And post-colonial feminism has been an interesting topic because so often women who have been in oppressed and colonized countries have said, well, freedom first and female liberation second. But I think those days have been overcome. And what we're seeing is that the resistance to power operates in feminism as much as it does in other forms of politics, because after all, this is a political area. And I think that the way in which post-colonial theory strategizes this is resistance through transformation. We went through a period of, the early in 20th century feminism was very much about resistance. And I think what we're seeing today is a much more sophisticated and more powerful form of feminism that operates in the way that post-colonial theory operates, and that is by transformation. I want to, I've written a book on this, but I want to say that transformation is the most powerful form of resistance, and I think post-colonial feminism is adapting that today. As we may know, women in formerly colonized societies often have various kinds of cultural and historical impediments to their full self-realization, and they are resisting these in ways that are familiar to any post-colonial theorist. It's a resistance that operates through the strategies of transformation, and I think that's happening more and more today. We in Australia, there's an enormous movement of powerful men in companies being brought to book by young women for their sexual harassment, and I think that things have changed radically in Australia and will throughout the world.
Thank you, sir. Our colleague Sunil Sinha, he has two questions, and both are related to the field of international relations, rather. Yeah. He says, post-colonialism today, the presumption is that colonialism is over. I am not talking about military occupation of a land, nor am I talking about the colonialism in terms of race, color, gender, etc. My question is related to international relations, particularly with reference to nuclear non-proliferation. Who decides which country should or should not have nuclear power, and is not the decision-making country acting as a colonial power? And his second question is not the WHO acting as a colony of one or the other superpowers in this time of pandemic? Over to you, sir.
Okay, there's a lot of issues there. In my first slide, I said and pointed out that post-colonial doesn't assume that colonialism has ended. Not at all. Colonialism continues as neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism continues into the present neoliberal capitalist world. And I would go further to say that in America, the culture of slavery, not just the culture of racism, the culture of slavery is deeply ingrained in the DNA of that country. And that's what leads to social and economic inequality, to racial inequality. And so I think that the issues of that are addressed by post-colonial theory are very much still in operation. So the nuclear proliferation, well, I'm not very supportive of anybody who wants to proliferate nuclear weapons. And the whole business is just crazy. It's in Reagan's time, there's a policy called MAD, mutually assured destruction, and that's what keeps the nuclear industry going. But the point, I guess, is who decides? Is there a form of colonial power operating? Well, probably yes. And there's it's a sense of the powerful. Who decides? It's the people with the most powerful nuclear armament arsenal. So, yeah, I mean, that's one that it simply demonstrates the proliferation of the separation of power in the world. And that's a separation that has been addressed by postcolonial theory all the time. Now, as far as the WHO is concerned, a colony of which you've got which superpower? I mean,
yeah. Of one or the other superpower.
You mean China or America? I mean, Trump has just quit from the WHO, so America's out, and it'd be interesting. I don't think America offers any leadership in the world today, but as far as the WHO's concerned, it's like any United Nations body. Can you say that they are totally and utterly independent? Well, they're probably no more independent than any other body in the world today. But it's an interesting question, but I think poor old World Health Organization is getting beaten up from every angle. So I won't contribute to it myself.
There is one more question in the field of international relation. Our research scholar friend Anisa Fatima says, can the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan be viewed from post-colonial perspective, even though they were not colonized in the traditional sense of the term?
This is one of the things that is post-colonial theory is branching out into, and that is the whole realm of the Middle East. Now, in fact, the Middle East was not colonized in the way other colonies were, but it was subject to power. It was subjected to a form of colonial incursion, I think, and it was most obvious in Egypt, but also in Iran and also in Iraq. And the whole of that Middle Eastern area, the region, was divided up as though it were they were colonies of the European powers. Most of the colonial discourse theorists are all non-white. The Subaltern Studies group. So I think that I don't think this one washes really, because ideas of liberation are there for everyone. And as far as Medusa, I haven't got a clue what to say about that. I don't know where the snakes come in. Snake hairdo. It's I'll let that one go through to the keeper.
The next question is from Sanjay Yadav, Associate Professor of English at Jamshedpur Cooperative College. He says, do you mean to say that nationalism as such is a hindrance to decolonization, or is it the hyper-nationalism which is being sold across the globe, which is problematic in achieving decolonization?
Yeah, well, exactly. Hyper-nationalism, nativism, populism, these things. There is a form of nationalism which means that you are conscious and careful of your nation. But I would say the nation, the people, is separate from the state. And that's why I use the term transnation. The nation state is a problem, and it is actually entrenched by this hyper-nationalism that is as kind of very often religious roots and partisanship. You see it in all kinds of countries. But I'd say that is the case. I mean, I guess when I'm talking about nationalism, I'm talking about a form of hyper-nationalism. But I would say that all nationalism has its basis in racism, no matter what nation. So think about that one.
The next question is from Dr. Huma Yaqub, Associate Professor, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Lucknow campus. And the question is, borders are fine as far as they provide an identity, help each one of us to interact, learn about different cultures and literatures. But they become toxic when they constrain, divide, raise feelings of hostility, hatred, and war. Could you please throw light on this matter?
Well, I think you've thrown light on it with that question, because I couldn't put it better myself. Yes, borders are fine if they encourage innovation, but the thing about borders is that borders by their nature are geared to separate us from them. And that's the problem with them. And, you know, we won't, I don't think we'll ever overcome that. When I start to think about a world without borders, it becomes more and more obviously impossible. So, you know, I'd say that what you're saying is correct. Whether borders themselves are fine really depends on what the borders are for. You know, the Russians are saying that a secure border is one with Russian soldiers on either side of it. So there's different ways of apprehending a border. You know.
Dr. Naresh Kumar of Ghatshila College also has a question regarding borders. He says that he takes up your comment, good literature is about unbelonging, about being borderless, that is, transcending borders. And he asks, doesn't this idea take us back to the liberal humanist idea of literature, where literature was expected to break all borders, temporal as well as spatial?
It is well, you know, we are living in post-humanist age, but Edward Said is very adamant about the existence of a non-Eurocentric humanism, and I think when we talk about power, when we talk about oppression, we have to take into account human beings, and so in that sense, it is a humanist idea that literature is a frontierless occupation. And that's, as Rushdie says, and I think that's extremely important because the issue of belonging is so powerful, so rife today. The idea of a form of creative production which is about unbelonging, I think is extremely powerful. And it may be humanist, but it's a humanism in the Edward Said vein, a humanism of the oppressed, a humanism of the non-European.
There's another colleague of ours, Rukhaya MK of Nehru College, Kerala, and the question is, isn't the idea of border primarily premised on the civilized-uncivilized dichotomy or the nature-culture dialectical pair?
Absolutely. The idea of a border is to separate us from them. Now, I'll give you an example. When settlers invaded Australia, they took up a piece of land and they put a fence around it. Now, a fence turned it into property, and the property meant that the absolute dark, as David Malouf puts it, the absolute dark of the indigenous people is outside beyond the border. Borders are definitely there to separate the civilized us from the uncivilized them, from our civilized society from the barbarians. That is the principle, and that is the problem with borders, because the other side of the border may not be barbarians at all. But they are, as far as you're concerned, they are other, and they are barbarians. Now, all of us have, no matter what kind of country we live in, we have this problem of borders, and there are people in government who exist to entrench those borders. And those borders are not only to keep out the others, but they're there to organise those people within. In Australia, there's an interesting thing. When you go through the airport, there's there's a tape that you walk through, and it says, keeping your borders safe. So in other words, the citizen walks through these things which are the borders, and it just demonstrates so clearly the borders are not just there to keep people out, they're there to keep the inhabitants under control. So they have a multifarious function, in fact. There's so many questions, it's amazing. But
well, there's a research scholar friend of ours, Vindhya C. from St. Joseph's College, Devagiri, Calicut, Kerala. And the question is, should there be an alliance between postcolonialism and eco-criticism for a green romanticism across borders?
A good question. Yes, there is. And of course, my colleague Helen Tiffin has been involved in postcolonial eco-criticism. See, postcolonialism and eco-criticism have a very long relationship because the expansion of Europe across the world brought weeds to every continent, brought plants and animals that ran rife, and so the spread of empire was absolutely catastrophic to the environment, and so there is a very strong relationship between postcolonialism and eco-criticism. And that's one of the growing themes of postcolonialism is eco-criticism, because it's not just about trying to stop the world collapsing. It's about recognizing that where this came from was the spread of empire, the spread of Europe throughout the world.
Well, a question from Dr. Bharti Sharma, Assistant Professor, Rajdhani College, University of Delhi. And the question is in the global scenario, how relevant it is to deliberate over the possibility of decolonization? Do you think we need to revise our definitions of decolonizations and nationalism vis-a-vis the post-colonial world?
Yeah. Well, this brings into question the whole field of decolonialism. And I just want to say that there's nothing in decolonial discourse that's any different from postcolonial theory. And although it sounds different, it's one aspect of postcolonial theory. The idea of uncoupling from the contemporary world, I don't think it's going to work. I mean, the principle I would suggest is the idea of transformation, interpolating the contemporary world and transforming it. This is a post-colonial strategy, not trying to decouple. Nobody can decouple themselves from the world, unless you go into a nunnery or a monastery. But so I think that the postcolonial theory offers a very distinct response to this, and that is, rather than decolonize in the sense of breaking away completely from the world, we should transform that world by interpolating. And creative writers have shown the way. They've shown the way in this, demonstrating how the wider world can be transformed by the presence of this totally different form of English literature.
The next question is from an MA Comparative Literature student of the University of Hyderabad, Nirupama Venkatesh, and she says, do utopian imaginations also become hegemonic structures? Because more often than not, utopian ideals are rooted in nationalistic aspirations. Does that not lead to a power imbalance, especially when the aspirations of the powerful and the powerless clash?
Yes, I think, yes, I agree. Now, one of the problems with Utopia is that in history, all achieved utopias became dystopias. You have the Third Reich, Stalinist Russia, neoliberal capitalism. All these were great utopian ideas that, when achieved, became dystopian to individuals. So I think, yes, it's a problematic thing that the idea of utopia, a political utopia, is always a problem, a power problem. And I think that nevertheless, achieved or not, utopianism, the idea of a better world, is the hope that drives us forward. And that can be something that can be transformative.
Another question is from Nisha. She's an assistant professor, Tetso College, Nagaland. And she says, respected sir, over the years, colonialism has changed its form. It's not as explicit as it was during the 19th and the 20th centuries. Political colonialism, but it's more subtle now. Economic, intellectual, or cultural colonialism in various ways. How long will colonialism prevail? And will we ever be actually completely and totally post-colonial? When will we have overcome colonialism in every way? Or will post-colonial remain with us always?
Well, you see, in that question is an assumption that the post is chronological. And I said that post-colonial is about reading strategies, about strategizing. And so, in that sense, we will never overcome the power imbalance in the world. But we are always able to interpolate the structures of power and transform, to some extent, their impact upon us. So, yeah, I mean, don't think that post-colonial means that colonialism's over. It certainly isn't. And that's why post-colonial theory, the strategies it develops, are still extremely valuable in helping us understand the contemporary world. It's the issues of power, of economic and military and political power operate just as much in the present world. And I would say that the post-colonial strategies that have been developed over decades are still appropriate to engage that colonized world.
And a final question put by Jayalakshmi. She says, whenever we read post-colonial literature, it always highlights resistance and looking back at past memories. Can we really revive the past? And can memory unfold the utopia that people are waiting for?
That's a good question. So often, the idea of memory is confused with nostalgia. Now, we cannot go back to some pre-colonial utopian past, but we can use memory to formulate a different kind of future. And that's, I think that's important, that we don't fall into the trap of thinking we can recover something that is gone, because culture is constantly transforming itself anyway. Culture is constantly on the move. And we need to realize that memory is not necessarily about nostalgia and going back to some pre-colonial past, but it's about having the consciousness of possibility, the consciousness of a cultural possibility that can be adapted to a contemporary world and transformed.
Thank you, sir. There are many more questions, but most of them would relate to the issues that you have already taken up. So I thank all our participants for active engagement. Your questions have really added to this beautiful and this insightful afternoon that we are having with Professor Ashcroft. Thank you, sir, for being so patient and for taking up each and every issue raised by all our participants. I now hand over the session to our presenter, Professor Roy.
Yes, I agree with Dhruvajyoti for the fact that the entire session would have remained incomplete, without this very, very engrossing question answer session. And we are immensely grateful to our very committed audience and to Professor Ashcroft for being so patient as to answer all our queries. We are, unfortunately, we are at the end of our session. We are nearing the end. And before requesting Professor Victor Mukherjee of New Alipur College to deliver the formal thanks, I would like to thank each and every member of the audience for being here today, for contributing to making the session so rich, and of course to Professor Ashcroft, because reading your work and listening to you personally are two very different experiences, believe me. For many of us, as people have confessed in the chat box, this will remain the experience of a lifetime. It was very memorable. And I was, I was visualizing a period around 13, 14 years ago when I was a student. And I was wondering, why did Professor Bill Ashcroft write a book called The Empire Writes Back? Because had he not written The Empire Writes Back, there would have been no post-colonial theory and no master's questions, no university asking us to write elaborate answers on why so-and-so text is post-colonial. So, that was a time when we were just beginning as students of theory, and believe me, kept on asking, why was this book ever written? And I never for a moment thought that I would get to actually virtually interact with one of the founders of postcolonial theory here. So thank you very much, Professor Ashcroft, for consenting to be, consenting to cast your doubts behind, because you have substantial doubts about the viability of the virtual forum. But thank you for overcoming all those hurdles and for being with us here today. So I would now request Dr. Victor Mukherjee of New Alipur College Department of English to kindly formally deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Roy. On behalf of the Departments of English, New Alipur College, Kolkata, and Karim City College, Jamshedpur, it gives me immense pleasure to thank Professor Bill Ashcroft for his gracious presence and his wide-ranging, insightful talk. It had been a fascinating experience for all of us. I would like to share another information that we have over 200 participants who have registered for this webinar, and even more than hundreds who had been following us in YouTube. So, sir, you can understand that your talk had been truly insightful and thought-provoking, and students, teachers, and scholars from the different parts of the corner of the globe had been able to participate, and they had been showing their interest over our talk. So I will express my thanks to Dr. S.M. Ibrahim, head of the department, Karim City College, Jamshedpur, Dr. Neha Tiwari, Dr. Basudhara Roy, Mr. A.K. Dash, and our special mention, special thanks to Professor Shaket Kumar, technical assistant for the program. I must express my special regard to Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi, the driving force behind this webinar. Sir, you had been a real inspiration for us, and the conversation with Professor Bill Ashcroft and Sir, it was a fantastic experience for every one of us. There had been three major parts which are covered in this webinar. The first is the lecture given by Professor Ashcroft, and then the conversation part, and then the question answer session which had been conducted by my colleague Dr. Dhruvajyoti Banerjee. And all these three different parts had been truly a wonderful experience for almost all the listeners who had been participating. I thank Professor Abul Mukhopadhyay, head of the department, New Alipur College, Dr. Neela Shorkar, Dr. Dhruvajyoti Banerjee, and it has been a wonderful experience for all of us. The two colleges had been working hand to hand during the last few weeks so that we can make it all successful. And the participation that we have received over the last 2 hours had been really fascinating for us. And also, I will also request and also ask for a promise from from Professor Bill Ashcroft that when things get normalized, after the pandemic situation is under control, when we will have everything back to normal, sir, please do come to our college. Please do come to our college, and we will just like to overcome all the barriers of this virtual medium, and we will like to have you address in a seminar which is going to be fascinating for everyone who had been eagerly listening to you for the last 2 hours. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
It was wonderful, Bill. Thank you so much. And